I want to thank you all again for joining us today as we continue on with our new members class. And we start today by talking about Southern Baptist history. We've already talked about why we are Baptist. Now today we're going to go through a little bit of Southern Baptist history as well as discussing the answer to the question of why exactly are we Southern Baptist. If we remember that Baptists came to North America to find religious freedom, to find and develop churches that believed in the separation of church and state, that believed in immersion baptism, believers' baptism, that believed in the priesthood of every believer, that believed in autonomous local churches. And so as the Baptists moved over to North America, they began to unify across the infant United States for the purpose of supporting international missions. And so while the Baptists agreed that they were still all local autonomous churches, they still recognized the importance of being able to pool resources in order to support as many missionaries going out as possible. And that was the theory behind pooling of resources, was that we could do more together than we could separately. So while we still, as Baptists, stayed as local autonomous churches, we recognized the value of cooperating with each other in order to send out and build the kingdom as best as possible. And so Baptists across the infant United States, for the purpose of supporting international missions, cooperated in terms of funding and sending out of missionaries. And so a missionary union was created between the Baptists. But as the United States progressed, and as issues of slavery started coming about, a debate began within the Baptist church about supporting missionaries and mission leaders who owned slaves. This debate began in the early 1800s. It had started to boil over, and then in the early 1800s, we start to see this debate play out. In 1844, it boiled over to what is called the Georgia Test case, where Southern Baptist churches put forth a slave owner candidate to be a missionary. And so these churches in the South, a lot of whom had slaveholders in their churches, and a lot of whom were dependent on slavery in terms of funding, put forth a slaveholder, a slave owner, as a candidate to be a missionary in overseas countries. Now, the Foreign Mission Board, which was the mission board at the time that would appoint these missionaries to go out, and it was a mix of North and South, determining which missionary should go out. The Foreign Mission Board, rightly so, denied this man to go out and be a missionary with his slaves. They would not accept it. And today, we would say and absolutely agree with that decision, that it would be completely inappropriate for a man who is a slave owner to go out and do missionary work, especially when he's taking his slaves out with him. This was completely inappropriate, but it was used as the Georgia Test case as the fodder for the Southern Baptists to split from the Northern Baptists. The Southern Baptists accused the Northern Baptists of not allowing them to appoint who they wanted. And so the Southern Baptists split from the Northern Baptists. Now we have to understand this preceded the Civil War, but had a lot of influence at the same time on the Civil War itself, because a lot of those churches played a part in what was about to come. But we see around this time in 1844, those splits, those divides start to happen. And the Southern Baptists split from the Northern Baptists for reasons that are really not Christian-like at all. And so we ask, why do we talk about the reasons for this? If we're a Southern Baptist church today, why do we even go back to this? And why are we Southern Baptists if this is how we started? We talk about the reasons for the split here to show that denominations, like man, are imperfect. Denominational structures and history are not perfect. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. But we need to first show that the Southern Baptists of today do not agree with the Southern Baptists and the reasons that they were started off to begin with. But the reasons why we are Southern Baptists today are very important. So while the start of the Southern Baptist denomination was not for good reasons, we still see that today, the Southern Baptists of today are very different than the Southern Baptists of the early 1800s and their reasonings for why they left. The Northern Baptists eventually split into many different Baptist denominations that we see today. Some good, some not so good, theologically. But the Southern Baptists have largely stayed intact as compared to the Northern Baptists. The Northern Baptists split off into many different denominations. The Southern Baptists really stuck together. And so what the Southern Baptists kept was orthodoxy and biblical doctrine and identity. Now, to fast forward a little bit, throughout Southern Baptist history, there have been many different struggles over orthodox biblical doctrine. Many different times in each generation, there has been struggles over doctrine within the Southern Baptists. The Southern Baptists had to wrestle through the slavery issue, had to wrestle through the racist beginnings of it, had to wrestle through many other different theological topics. Landmark Baptists were part of the Southern Baptists originally, but that was a struggle that we had to go through and overcome. And so really with each generation has had to deal with a theological struggle within the Southern Baptists. The most recent one is something we call the conservative resurgence. In the 1970s, a major struggle broke out within the Southern Baptists. A major struggle broke out over the entire issue of biblical inerrancy, as well as conservative theology and what was being taught in the seminaries. There were multiple different causes that led to the beginning of the conservative resurgence, but two big ones. One was a commentary on Genesis that came out, where they saw some signs of teaching that might stray away from what is orthodox teachings in seminaries. And then finally there was a study done in the mid-1970s by a student who found that students entering the seminaries were leaving the seminary discarding biblical orthodox doctrines. Like, for instance, the doctrine that says Jesus is God, the deity of Christ. Students were entering the seminaries of the Southern Baptists in an overwhelming majority believing that, but for some reason in those 4 years, were leaving at lower rates of believing that. And so something was being taught in the seminaries that did not reflect what Southern Baptist churches wanted coming out. And so the struggle for the heart of the Southern Baptist Convention really started to take hold. And it ended with the conservatives taking back control of the denomination and a return for biblical inerrancy. Throughout the 1980s, there were multiple elections, multiple conventions that were held that were big struggles for the convention, where votes occurred, where people's feelings were hurt, where there were a lot of friendly fire going on both sides. And yet, we see the reasonings for the taking control of the denomination back was hugely important in order that our seminaries taught things that we see are biblically orthodox. That we couldn't allow liberal theology to keep taking a foothold within the Southern Baptist Convention. And so, a plan was laid out, and throughout the 80s it was enacted. And by the mid-1990s, seminaries were taken back from professors who were teaching things out of line with biblical doctrine. And so it ended with the conservatives taking back control, rightfully so, of a denomination and a return to biblical inerrancy. The Southern Baptist Convention is the only denomination to return to conservative theology after being under theologically liberal leadership. Most times what happens when a leadership of a denomination goes more towards the liberal side is usually the conservatives within the denomination will leave and start their own denomination, which is what happened a lot of times with the Northern Baptists, why a lot of their splits happened. But for the Southern Baptists are the only ones thus far who have taken back the convention from theologically liberal and unorthodox and frankly heretical teachings. And with this return to biblical orthodoxy, the Southern Baptists have apologized and the leadership have apologized for the roots of the Southern Baptists. We need to understand that the Southern Baptists have recognized that it did not begin on good grounds. That although there was some good biblical orthodox teaching going on, it does not justify the roots of the Southern Baptists. and the slavery that was advocated for there. And so the Southern Baptists have apologized for its advocacy of slavery and racist policies, and it has made moves not only to reject racist ideology and the idea of slavery, but it also has made moves to remove churches that might promote racism. In multiple different cases throughout recent history with the denomination, multiple churches have been removed from fellowship with the Southern Baptists because of their promotion of racial ideology. And so we need to understand here that the Southern Baptists have made moves to reject what it was, some of the principles that it was started on. That this racist ideology has no place in the Southern Baptist Church anymore. What we do stand for is biblical orthodoxy. What we do stand for is cooperation. What we do stand for is the gospel for every man, woman, and child on this planet. And so why are we Southern Baptists? First, Southern Baptists have one of the largest missionary organizations on the planet. And this is based off of that theory that we are better off together than we are apart. It right now takes tens of thousands of dollars to send even one missionary internationally full-time. And yet, if we pool our resources together, we pool our resources and cooperate together, we feel that we can put more missionaries out than we could if we just did it alone. That we can send more people out, that we can reach more people with the gospel across the world than if we just win it alone. And so we realize that we are better off together cooperating than apart. Hence why we do what we call the cooperative program. The cooperative program is a program within the Southern Baptists where we, as an autonomous Southern Baptist church, give a portion of our budget to the national convention and to our local regional convention in order to be able to send missionaries out, to plant churches, to do the work of the gospel. As we do the work of the gospel here, we also support those going out and taking the gospel to other places as well. And so the cooperative program really is based around this idea that we are better off together than we are apart. We are still theoretically controlled by local churches and not a denomination. We are still an autonomous local church. We can decide how much we give to the cooperative program. We can give nothing. We can give everything. We can give as much as we want. And so we are not controlled by the denomination. No. Instead, we have influence over the denomination because we are local autonomous churches who are cooperating together. And the leadership of the denomination really answers to us. And so with this, we need to understand we also have access to so many different opportunities, from missionary organizations to training opportunities to gospel outreach here and around the world. And we also have theological distinctions that we hold together. And this is why we are Southern Baptists. For the cooperation and for the theology behind it. That we believe in biblical inerrancy. That we believe in the orthodox doctrines that we hold strongly to. We believe in these things together. So with that mindset of holding together theological doctrines and cooperating together, we are able to build the kingdom together. And so, why are we Southern Baptists? Because, one, orthodox doctrine, and two, we're better off together than we are apart. And we can do a lot more good for the kingdom with each other than apart from each other. And so, there's a lot of opportunities that come with being a Southern Baptist. Did you know that with the Southern Baptist Cooperative Program, that those who are interested in going into training, whether you're wanting to become a pastor or not, doesn't matter. If you're wanting to get some biblical training at a seminary level, guess what? Because you are a Southern Baptist, you get half off tuition from a Southern Baptist school or seminary. Just because you are a Southern Baptist. That's all because we recognize that we are better off together than we are apart. And so what we need to understand are these three things right here. First, no person is perfect. When we look back at some of the roots where the Southern Baptists began, we realize one thing. Mankind is not perfect, nor is our denomination. We have had a lot of struggles. We have had a lot of things that have happened that began the Southern Baptists that we look back on and we should not be proud of. Instead, we should learn from them, and we should make apologies, and we should repent of them, which we have started doing. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing to look back and go, this was wrong, and we're going to make it right. So we need to recognize that no person, no denomination is perfect, which is also why we also believe that no denomination should have absolute authority over a local church. No overall denomination should hold authority over this church. Why? Because we're not always going to agree with the denomination. We're not always going to agree with some of the things they do. But guess what? Vine Street is still going to be Vine Street, no matter what happens with the Southern Baptists. We are Southern Baptists because right now we most agree with the theology that's backing the Southern Baptists, and we agree that we are better together than we are apart. And so we believe it is best for Vine Street to cooperate and to associate with the Southern Baptists and with the Northwest Baptists because of the opportunities and the things that we can share together. No denomination should have absolute authority over a local church because no person is perfect. But that's why we also hold as Southern Baptists, as the Bible, this as our highest authority and not mankind. One of the big problems of the early Southern Baptists is the fact that they held on to their traditions like slavery more than they did this right here. Because if they had held this as their highest standard, they would realize that what they were doing is wrong. And so the Southern Baptists have come to recognize that this has to be our highest authority, the Bible. And so, no denomination is perfect, but we do the best we can. And we move forward together in trying to build the kingdom and deliver the gospel to every man, woman, child on this planet. And we do that through the mechanisms that we have within the Southern Baptist denomination in order that we might fulfill that purpose, because we recognize that we are better off together than we are apart.